Hey friends, welcome back. This week we are going to be looking at the fourth lesson in this unit of 6 lessons called It's All About Jesus. We've been through the first 3 lessons so far, and this Sunday we're going to be looking at the death of Jesus. This Sunday is actually Palm Sunday, when we would typically celebrate the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, but it's really the best time, if we're going to study the crucifixion, it's the best time to do that because it is the Sunday prior to the resurrection. So, the death of Jesus, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 23, verses 32 through 49. Now, a good question to start off with, just to ask your class, did Jesus have to die? Did Jesus have to die? Now, I would imagine that most people, certainly probably people studying this lesson, are going to answer appropriately, yes, he did have to die. But it may be good for us to realize and recognize that within a lot of theological circles today, people are suggesting that it was not necessary for Jesus to die. He died because he made the Romans angry. He died because he made the Jewish leadership angry, but it wasn't necessary for him to die. His death didn't actually accomplish anything. Well, that is not what Luke teaches us. That's not what historic Christianity teaches us. So, just ask the question, did Jesus have to die? Let people respond. Talk about that a little bit. And then at the end, we're going to come back and see how, in fact, based on these verses, it really was necessary for Jesus to die. Okay, now, remember that the context for all of these lessons is the kingdom of God. For Luke, this is the paramount issue throughout his gospel, and it was the thing for which Jesus came. When we looked at the mission of Jesus, we said that Jesus' mission was to announce and to establish the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God has been significant in every one of the lessons, and it's very central to what is happening in the text that we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so let's jump right in. Looking first of all at Luke chapter 23, verses 32 to 34. Reading from the Teacher Guide. Luke says, 2 other criminals were also led away to be executed with him. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they are doing. And they divided his clothes and cast lots. So let me point out several things of interest in these verses. First of all, you need to understand that the crucifixion is where the entire gospel has been going. For Luke, all of the gospel has been moving toward the crucifixion. And we've seen things all through these earlier 3 lessons indicating that Jesus was bringing the kingdom through sacrificial love. He was establishing the kingdom through sacrificial love. And now his death is going to become the ultimate expression or the ultimate sacrifice of love, which is where Luke has been taking us throughout the entire gospel. I would also note, even though it's not in this particular text, the story of Barabbas comes shortly before this. Now, for Luke, that helps us understand that the death of Jesus was substitutionary. In other words, Jesus isn't just out here dying for no reason or for his own purposes. He's dying as a substitute for you and I. So the death of Jesus is substitutionary, even though it's not particularly noted in these verses we just read. I would also note that according to these verses, it's clear that Luke wants to make it obvious that Jesus was innocent. His death was undeserved. He's crucified with criminals, but it's been made clear prior to this, and it's going to be made clear after this, that Jesus was not himself a criminal. So, the death of Jesus was substitutionary, and the death of Jesus was undeserved. And finally, I would note, based on these verses, is that his death was loving. Look at verse 34. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they're doing. Even on the cross, even as Jesus is hanging there, his sacrificial love is going through. His love for people is being demonstrated. So it was a loving sacrifice. And I would point out too that his crucifixion, the spirit of Jesus as he is on the cross, is consistent with his entire life and ministry. And this is something that Luke wants us to understand, that all along we see Jesus characterized, his ministry characterized by sacrificial love, and that becomes true even to the point of death, even to the point of this horrific crucifixion, this sacrificial death. Jesus maintains his sacrificial love. He stays consistent with his love all the way to the end. Okay? All right, let's go to Luke chapter 23, verses 35 to 43. The people stood watching, and even the leaders were scoffing. He saved others. Let him save himself if this is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him. They came offering him sour wine and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." An inscription was above him, "This is the King of the Jews." Then one of the criminals hanging there began to yell insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, rebuking him, "Don't you even fear God, since you are undergoing the same punishment? We are punished justly, because we're getting back what we deserve for the things we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, Jesus said to the criminal, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So a couple of things I want you to notice. First of all, this is a pretty long passage, but just a couple of things quickly. Notice that Luke again distances Jesus from the Jewish leadership. And you'll recall that part of what Luke is trying to do throughout his gospel is help his Roman readers understand that Jesus is not and was not in cahoots with the rebellious Jews in Jerusalem and Judea at the time of the Jewish-Roman War, some 30 years after this takes place. The Jewish leaders, not only is Jesus not in a co-conspirator with them, they are actually the ones to some degree responsible for his death. And Luke makes that very clear, providing some distance between Jesus and the Jewish leadership. But notice too, the irony, verse 38, an inscription was above him. And Luke intends for this to be ironic, because the inscription, the sign above Jesus, says, "This is the King of the Jews." Now remember, all along we've been talking about the kingdom of God. So here again, Luke makes it clear that Jesus is the King. The inscription was intended to be a mocking of Jesus, but Luke uses it to actually make the announcement of the reality that Jesus is in fact the King of the Jews. And that's not how the Romans would have perceived it at the time. That's not how the Jewish leadership perceived it at the time. But Luke, decades later, is making the point that even though they intended to mock him through this inscription, in fact, they were joining with Jesus in his announcement that he was the King of the Jews. Finally, I want to point out that when it comes down to this criminal, the criminal says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." We typically interpret this passage or this event to suggest that, well, see, this man gave his life to Jesus on the cross, and now when he dies, he's going to be in heaven. And yes, that is certainly the case. That is certainly true. But Luke's real purpose in this little story here, this little event, is for Jesus to say that because of my death, paradise, or the kingdom, because paradise in this context would be another reference to the kingdom. The kingdom is here, and you will be in the kingdom because of my death. It is about the man becoming part of the kingdom, but the real point of the text, the real point of the event, is that it is Jesus' death that secures the kingdom. The reason this man could anticipate being in paradise, being in the kingdom, that particular day was because Jesus knew he was going to die that particular day. So really, this is Luke's way of saying that the crucifixion and Jesus' death secured the kingdom. So everything we've seen up to this point, all moving toward the cross, all moving toward the cross, all moving toward the cross, because Luke understood and here demonstrates that it is on the cross that Jesus secures the kingdom. Okay? Let's move to the next text. Luke 23, 44 through 49. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3, because the sun's light failed. The curtain of the sanctuary was split down the middle. That's a reference to the wall in the temple that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Okay? So it's that wall. And Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit." Saying this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what happened, he began to glorify God, saying, "This man really was righteous." All the crowds that had gathered for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, went home striking their chests. They were moved by this. But all who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. So just a couple of things I want to point out about these verses. First of all, the death of Jesus was a cataclysmic event. It was an event that impacted not just the spiritual world, but the physical world as well. So because of his death, it was about noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3. So in the midst of this death, something happens. Just as when Adam and Eve sinned, it was cataclysmic. It impacted the entire world. Our world is fallen because of that sin. Sin had a cataclysmic impact on our physical world. So when Jesus died, his death had a cataclysmic impact on the physical world, and he began to reverse the impact of sin back in the garden, the story of Adam and Eve. So it was a cataclysmic event. And I would also point out, because of the curtain, the splitting of the curtain, it was a turning point for Israel. This moment when Jesus died represents a turning point for Israel. In a sense, God is saying that all that you have been, all that I have used the Jews for up to this point, the Jewish nation of Israel, all of that is changing now. By splitting the curtain, God is making a distinct statement that that is the way of the past. Now something new has come. So the splitting of the curtain represents the changing of the Old Testament to the New Testament. So this was a turning point for Israel. And finally, I would point out, as we've noted before, here the centurion, even the Roman centurion says, you know what? Jesus was innocent. So here again, Luke makes the point that the Roman leaders found him innocent, and even this centurion, as he's responsible for crucifying Jesus, looks and says, you know what? Jesus was innocent. He was righteous. So, going back to the question, did Jesus have to die? If we look at these verses, we have to say and conclude, absolutely yes. Jesus' death accomplished something. It secured the kingdom of God and made the kingdom of God possible. So now, everything we do as God's people is the result of what Jesus accomplished on the cross. Jesus had to die in order to accomplish his mission and his purpose. Thanks for listening.